The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape when Sarah Mackenzie stepped into the shallow creek behind her family's homestead. The water felt cool against her skin after 3 days of relentless heat that had baked the Arizona territory. She had waited until her father rode out to check the cattle and her mother went to visit the sick neighbor before allowing herself this rare moment of privacy. Sarah was 19 years old, with auburn hair that caught the sunlight like copper wire. Her family had come west from Missouri 2 years ago, drawn by promises of free land and new beginnings. What they found was a harsh landscape where survival meant constant vigilance. Apache raids were common in this territory, and every settler family knew someone who had lost everything to the fierce warriors who considered this land their ancestral home. The creek ran clear and cold, fed by mountain springs that never seemed to dry up even in the hottest months. Sarah had discovered this secluded spot shortly after their arrival, hidden by tall cottonwood trees and thick brush. It became her sanctuary, the one place where she could escape the endless chores and the fear that shadowed their daily lives. As she waded deeper into the water, Sarah heard her mother's voice echoing in her memory. "Never go anywhere alone, Sarah. The Apache move like ghosts through this country. You could be here one moment and gone the next, and we'd never know what happened." But the oppressive heat and the promise of cool water had overcome her caution. The creek bottom was smooth stone, worn by countless years of flowing water. Small fish darted between the rocks, their silver bodies flashing in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the tree branches. Sarah closed her eyes and let the water wash away the dust and sweat of frontier life. For a few precious moments, she could imagine herself back in Missouri, where creeks were places of play rather than desperate necessity. A twig snapped somewhere in the brush. Sarah froze, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. She strained to hear over the gentle murmur of the creek, but the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had ceased. Moving slowly, she began to make her way toward the bank where she had left her clothes. Every step seemed impossibly loud, the water splashing around her ankles like thunder in the sudden silence. Her hands shook as she reached for the rough homespun dress that represented safety and modesty. That was when she saw him. He stood motionless among the cottonwoods, as still as the trees themselves. An Apache warrior, his dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders, his face painted with stripes of red and yellow ochre. He wore buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest bare except for a necklace of bear claws. In his hands, he held a rifle that looked newer than anything her family owned. Sarah's scream caught in her throat. She was trapped in the middle of the creek, completely exposed, with 20 feet of open water between her and her clothes. The warrior stepped forward, emerging from the shadows like something from a nightmare. His eyes never left her face. "Please," she whispered, though she knew he probably didn't understand English. "Please don't hurt me." The Apache warrior studied her with dark eyes that revealed nothing of his thoughts. He was younger than she had first assumed, perhaps in his early 20s, with strong features and a lean, muscular build that spoke of a life spent in the harsh desert. Unlike the savage demons her neighbors described, he seemed almost curious rather than threatening. He spoke a few words in his own language, his voice low and controlled. When Sarah didn't respond, he gestured toward her clothes on the bank. Then, to her amazement, he turned his back to her. Sarah stood frozen in confusion. This was not how the stories went. Apache warriors were supposed to be merciless killers who showed no mercy to white settlers. They were supposed to scalp their victims and burn their homes. They were not supposed to show modesty toward a defenseless woman. The warrior spoke again, more firmly this time, and gestured again toward her clothes. Slowly, Sarah understood. He was giving her permission to dress herself, but he was also making it clear that she would come with him afterward. With trembling hands, she waded to the bank and pulled on her dress. The rough fabric felt strange against her wet skin, but it provided a barrier against the warrior's presence. When she was fully clothed, she turned to face him. He had already moved to cut off her escape route back toward the homestead. His rifle remained ready but not directly threatening. When he motioned for her to walk ahead of him, Sarah realized she had no choice but to comply. As they moved through the forest, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps if she cooperated, he would eventually let her go. Perhaps her father would come looking for her when she failed to return home. Perhaps this was all a terrible dream from which she would soon awaken. The warrior led her along paths that seemed invisible to her untrained eye. He moved through the brush like a shadow, making no sound despite the rifle and equipment he carried. Sarah, in contrast, felt clumsy and loud, her dress catching on thorns and her feet stumbling over roots and stones. After what felt like hours of walking, they emerged from the forest into a small clearing where several horses waited. The animals were beautiful creatures, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Sarah had heard that Apache warriors were among the finest horsemen in the world, and, seeing these magnificent animals, she could believe it. The warrior gestured for her to mount one of the horses. Sarah had ridden before, but always side saddle and always on the gentle farm horses her family owned. These animals seemed different, wilder and more spirited. The horse she was assigned was a paint mare with intelligent eyes and a coat of brown and white patches. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Sarah tried to memorize landmarks that might help her find her way home. A distinctive rock formation here, a lightning-struck tree there, a creek that bent sharply to the left. But the landscape seemed to blur together in an endless expanse of desert, mountain, and forest. The warrior rode slightly ahead and to one side, always keeping her in sight but never crowding her. He seemed relaxed, as if he were simply traveling through familiar territory rather than kidnapping a white woman. This casual attitude was somehow more frightening than open hostility would have been. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah realized they must be traveling toward an Apache camp. Her knowledge of Apache customs was limited to the horror stories told by other settlers, but she knew that white captives were sometimes adopted into the tribe. The thought of living among the Apache, of never seeing her family again, filled her with a despair deeper than fear. The warrior called out in his own language, and the call was answered from somewhere ahead. Soon, they were riding down a narrow canyon where smoke from cooking fires drifted up between tall rock walls. The Apache camp appeared gradually, hidden so well among the rocks and trees that Sarah didn't see it until they were almost upon it. There were perhaps 20 dwellings, constructed of brush and animal hides in a style completely foreign to Sarah's experience. Horses grazed in a natural corral formed by the canyon walls, and children played among the shelters while women worked at various tasks. The scene was so normal, so domestic, that it jarred with Sarah's expectations of savage warriors living in barbaric squalor. The people of the camp gathered to watch as the warrior led Sarah into their midst. She expected hostility, perhaps even violence, but what she saw in their faces was mainly curiosity. Children stared with wide eyes, and women whispered among themselves in rapid Apache. The men remained more reserved, but none showed the bloodthirsty cruelty she had been taught to expect. The warrior dismounted and helped Sarah down from her horse. His touch was gentle but firm, making it clear that she was not free to leave but also that she was not in immediate danger. He led her toward one of the larger shelters, speaking to an older woman who emerged to greet them. The woman was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair and a face that showed the lines of a life lived under the desert sun. Her clothing was similar to what the other women wore, buckskin decorated with beads and shells, but her bearing suggested authority within the community. She looked Sarah up and down with sharp, intelligent eyes. A rapid conversation followed in Apache, with the warrior apparently explaining how he had found Sarah. The older woman asked several questions, and Sarah noticed that the warrior's answers seemed to satisfy her. Finally, the woman nodded and gestured for Sarah to follow her. Inside the shelter, Sarah found herself in a space that was surprisingly comfortable. Woven mats covered the floor, and various household items hung from the framework of poles that supported the structure. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke escaping through an opening at the top. The older woman indicated that Sarah should sit on one of the mats. The woman brought Sarah a bowl of water and some food, a kind of flatbread and what appeared to be dried meat. She spoke in Apache, her tone not unfriendly but clearly indicating that Sarah should eat. Realizing that she was indeed hungry after the long ride, Sarah accepted the offered meal. As she ate, Sarah tried to make sense of her situation. She was clearly a prisoner, but she was being treated more like a guest than a captive. The warrior had not harmed her, despite having found her in an extremely vulnerable position. The older woman seemed to be taking responsibility for her welfare. None of this matched the story she had heard about Apache cruelty. The warrior appeared in the entrance to the shelter and spoke briefly with the older woman. Then, he turned to Sarah and spoke in halting English. "You safe here. No harm come to you." Sarah stared at him in shock. "You speak English?" "Little bit," he replied. "Learn from trader man. You no try run away. Desert dangerous. You die if you go alone. What do you want with me?" Sarah asked, though she feared the answer. The warrior considered her question for a moment. "You come from water place. Water is sacred to my people. Maybe spirits send you to us." He paused, then added, "My name is Ayana. It means eternal blossom. You have name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah," he repeated, pronouncing each syllable carefully. "Good name. You stay with grandmother until I know what spirits want." The older woman, apparently understanding some English herself, nodded approvingly. She spoke to Ayana in Apache, and he replied before turning back to Sarah. "Grandmother says you tired from long ride. You rest now. Tomorrow we talk more." As night fell over the canyon, Sarah lay on the mat provided for her, staring up at the stars visible through the smoke hole. The sounds of the Apache camp settling down for the night were strangely comforting. Children's voices calling out final words before sleep, women banking cooking fires, men speaking in low voices about the events of the day. She thought of her parents, who must be frantic with worry by now. Her father would have returned from checking the cattle to find her missing. They would have searched the immediate area around the homestead, calling her name until their voices were hoarse. By now, they might have ridden to the nearest neighbor for help, or even to the territorial capital to report her disappearance to the authorities. But Sarah was beginning to realize that escape might be impossible. The Apache camp was hidden in a maze of canyons and desert that she could never navigate alone. Even if she managed to steal a horse, she had no idea which direction would lead her home. And Ayana's warning about the dangers of the desert was not an empty threat. She had heard stories of people who became lost in the wilderness, dying of thirst within miles of water. As she drifted toward sleep, Sarah found herself thinking about the warrior who had captured her. Ayana was not at all what she had expected from an Apache raider. He had shown her consideration and even a kind of respect that surprised her. His explanation about the sacred nature of water and the possibility that spirits had guided their meeting suggested a spiritual dimension to her capture that she didn't understand. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was the sound of someone playing a flute somewhere in the camp. The melody was haunting and beautiful, unlike any music she had ever heard. It seemed to speak of vast open spaces and ancient traditions, of a people whose connection to the land ran deeper than anything her own culture could comprehend. When Sarah woke the next morning, sunlight was already streaming through the entrance to the shelter. The older woman, whom she now thought of as grandmother, was preparing some kind of breakfast over the small fire. The smell of cooking meat made Sarah's stomach rumble with hunger. Outside the shelter, the camp was already active. She could hear voices and the sounds of daily activities beginning. Children laughed and called to each other, and somewhere nearby, a woman was singing in Apache while she worked. Grandmother brought Sarah a bowl of food and indicated that she should eat. The meal consisted of the same flatbread she had eaten the night before, along with some kind of cooked meat and a handful of berries. The food was simple but nourishing, and Sarah found herself eating with more appetite than she had felt in days. As she ate, Sarah studied her surroundings more carefully. The shelter was ingeniously constructed, providing protection from the elements while allowing for ventilation and light. The various items hanging from the poles included what appeared to be tools, weapons, and household goods, all made with the kind of practical efficiency that spoke of generations of experience living in this harsh environment. Ayana appeared at the entrance, and Sarah noticed that he looked different in the morning light. The war paint was gone from his face, revealing features that were strong but not harsh. His hair was neatly braided, and his clothing appeared to be his everyday wear rather than the gear of a raiding party. "Sarah," he said, pronouncing her name with the same careful attention to each syllable. "You sleep well?" "Yes," she replied, surprised to realize it was true. Despite her circumstances, she had slept more soundly than she had in weeks. "Good. Today I show you camp. You meet people. Maybe you understand why spirits bring you here." Sarah finished her breakfast and followed Ayanna out into the morning sunlight. The Apache camp looked different in daylight, less mysterious and more like what it actually was, a community of people going about their daily lives. Women were preparing food, tending to children, and working on various crafts. Men were checking weapons and equipment or caring for the horses. Children played games that seemed universal despite the cultural differences. Ayanna led Sarah through the camp with a quiet pride that surprised her. He stopped frequently to speak with various people, and, while the conversations were in Apache, Sarah could tell that he was introducing her and explaining her presence. The responses were varied, some people showing obvious curiosity, others maintaining the reserved politeness that seemed to characterize Apache's social interactions. At the far end of the camp, where the canyon opened into a wider area, they found a group of children playing a game that involved throwing pointed sticks at a rolling hoop. The children paused their game to stare at Sarah, their dark eyes wide with fascination. One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, approached cautiously and reached out to touch Sarah's auburn hair. "She never see hair like fire before," Ayanna explained. "Apache hair always black. Your hair like sunset." The little girl giggled and said something in Apache that made Ayanna smile. "She says you pretty like morning sky," he translated. Despite her situation, Sarah found herself smiling back at the child. The innocence and friendliness of the children helped to ease some of her fear. These were not the savage demons of settler folklore, but simply people living their lives according to customs she didn't understand. As they continued their tour of the camp, Ayanna pointed out various features and explained their purposes. The corral where the horses were kept was positioned to allow quick access in case of danger, but also to provide the best grazing within the protected canyon. The placement of the dwellings took advantage of natural windbreaks and morning sun while avoiding areas where flash floods might pose a danger. "My people live here many seasons," Ayanna said. "This place safe, hidden. Water always flows, grass good for horses. Game trails come through canyon, so hunting good too." "Is this where you were born?" Sarah asked. Ayanna shook his head. "I born far south, near place white men call Mexico. My people move with seasons, follow game, avoid soldiers. But this place, this is special. Old stories say spirits live in rocks here." They stopped beside a natural pool formed by the creek that ran through the canyon. The water was crystal clear, fed by a small waterfall that cascaded down the rock wall. Sarah could see fish swimming in the depths, and the banks were lined with plants she didn't recognize. "Water sacred to Apache," Ayanna said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "All life come from water. When I find you in water place, I know spirits have plan." "What kind of plan?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Ayanna studied her face for a long moment. "I not know yet. Must wait for signs. But I think maybe you meant to be here." The idea that her capture was somehow predestined disturbed Sarah more than outright hostility would have. She had been raised to believe in Christian providence, but this Apache concept of spiritual intervention felt foreign and unsettling. Yet she couldn't deny that her current situation was unlike anything she could have imagined. They were interrupted by the arrival of another warrior, this one older than Ayanna and bearing scars that spoke of many battles. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his tone urgent. Ayanna's expression became serious as he listened, and Sarah could sense that something important was being discussed. Finally, Ayanna turned to her. "Scout brings news. Soldiers come this way, maybe 2 days' ride from here. Looking for missing white woman." Sarah's heart leaped with hope and fear in equal measure. Rescue was possible, but what would happen in the meantime? Would the Apache kill her rather than let her be found by the soldiers? Would they simply move deeper into the wilderness where no one could follow? What will you do? She asked. Must talk with council, Ayana replied. Grandmother will take you back to shelter. You stay there until we decide. The walk back to the shelter seemed longer than before, and Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in the camp had changed. People were moving with more purpose, and she could see warriors checking their weapons and equipment. The children had been called in from their games, and the women were gathering essential supplies. Grandmother met them at the shelter and spoke briefly with Ayana before taking Sarah inside. The older woman seemed to sense Sarah's agitation, because she began speaking in a mixture of Apache and broken English, apparently trying to reassure her. No fear, grandmother said. Ayana good man. He not let harm come to you. But, the soldiers, Sarah began. Soldiers mean trouble for all, grandmother replied. Not just for you. They come, maybe people die. Apache, maybe white woman too. Better if soldiers not find. The implications of this statement chilled Sarah. If the rescue attempt went badly, she might die in the crossfire. But, the alternative was remaining with the Apache indefinitely, and she wasn't sure she could accept that either. Hours passed slowly as Sarah waited in the shelter. She could hear activity outside, people moving around and speaking in urgent tones. Several times, warriors came to speak with grandmother, and Sarah gathered that some kind of debate was taking place about what to do with her. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ayana finally appeared. He looked tired, as if the discussions had been difficult and lengthy. Council has decided, he announced. We move camp tonight. Go deeper into mountains where soldiers cannot follow. And, me? Sarah asked. You come with us, Ayana said. But, first, I tell you something important. Soldiers bring danger to my people. If they find camp, many will die. Apache warriors, women, children. All because they look for one white woman. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. She hadn't asked to be captured, but her presence was now endangering innocent people. The children who had smiled at her, the women who had shown her kindness, the warriors who had treated her with respect rather than cruelty, all were at risk because of her. What if I went back? She asked quietly. What if I told them I escaped on my own, that I never saw any Apache? Ayana shook his head. Too dangerous. Desert at night, many ways to die. And, soldiers not believe story. They keep looking, maybe find other Apache camps. Then, what do you suggest? You stay with us. Learn our ways. Maybe in time, when danger passed, we find way to get you home safe. The prospect of an extended captivity filled Sarah with dread, but she was beginning to understand that her situation was more complex than simple kidnapping. She was caught between two worlds, two peoples who viewed each other as mortal enemies. Any decision she made would have consequences for others. As if reading her thoughts, Ayana continued. I know this hard for you. You want to go home, see family again. But sometimes what we want and what spirits plan for us not same thing. I don't understand your spirits, Sarah said. Maybe you learn, Ayana replied. Apache believe everything connected. Water, rocks, animals, people. All part of Great Circle. Maybe you part of Circle too now. That night, Sarah watched as the Apache broke down their camp with practiced efficiency. Within hours, the dwellings were dismantled and packed onto horses, and all traces of human habitation were carefully erased. The people moved through the darkness like ghosts, making no unnecessary sound. Sarah rode beside grandmother on a gentle mare, following trails that seemed invisible in the moonlight. The Apache moved with absolute confidence through terrain that would have been impassable for less experienced travelers. They knew every rock, every turn, every potential danger. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah looked back toward the canyon that had briefly been her home. Somewhere behind them, soldiers were probably making camp, unaware that their quarry had already slipped away into the vast wilderness. The new campsite was even more remote than the first, hidden in a box canyon accessible only through a narrow passage that could be easily defended. By dawn, the Apache had established their dwellings once again, and life resumed its normal patterns as if the move had never happened. But Sarah noticed changes in how she was treated. People seemed more accepting of her presence, as if her willingness to travel with them rather than attempt escape had earned their respect. Children approached her more freely, and some of the women began including her in their daily activities. Grandmothers started teaching her basic Apache words and phrases. "Nalen," she would say, pointing to the sky. "Ga," indicating the rabbit that was roasting over the fire. "Sherma," touching her own chest to indicate herself. Sarah found herself responding to these lessons with more enthusiasm than she had expected. The Apache language was unlike anything she had encountered, with sounds and rhythms that seemed to echo the landscape itself. Learning to communicate, even in simple phrases, made her feel less isolated and helpless. Ayana continued to visit her regularly, and their conversations became more substantial as Sarah's understanding of Apache words grew and his English improved through practice. He told her stories about his people's history, their migrations across the vast southwestern territories, their relationships with the land and the animals that shared it. "Long time ago," he said one evening as they sat beside the fire, "Apache and white men live in peace. Trade together, sometimes fight same enemies. But more white people come, want all land for themselves. Push Apache away from good places, from water, from hunting grounds. My family just wanted a farm," Sarah said. "We didn't know we were taking anything from anyone." "Your family good people, maybe," Ayana acknowledged. "But government men, soldier men, they want Apache gone. Dead or on reservation far away. So Apache fight to stay alive." The conversation helped Sarah understand that her capture was part of a much larger conflict, one with roots going back generations. She began to see that both sides had legitimate grievances, both had suffered losses, and both were fighting for survival in their own way. As days passed, Sarah found herself settling into the rhythms of Apache life. She learned to help with food preparation, to identify edible plants, and to understand the complex social relationships that governed camp life. The work was hard but satisfying in a way that her previous life had never been. The Apache women accepted her gradually, teaching her skills that were essential for survival in the desert. She learned to weave baskets from plant fibers, to preserve meat for long storage, and to read the subtle signs that indicated weather changes or the approach of dangerous animals. Most surprisingly, she found herself looking forward to her daily conversations with Ayana. He was intelligent and thoughtful, with a deep knowledge of the natural world that impressed her. His English continued to improve, and she began to pick up more Apache, allowing their communications to become increasingly sophisticated. One evening, about 2 weeks after the move to the new camp, Ayana found Sarah sitting alone beside the creek, watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. "You sad tonight," he observed, settling beside her on a flat rock. "I was thinking about my parents," Sarah admitted. "They must think I'm dead by now." "Maybe someday you see them again," Ayana said. "When safe?" "Will it ever be safe?" Sarah asked. "This war between your people and mine, does it ever end?" Ayana was quiet for a long time, considering her question. War end when one side win, or when both sides too tired to fight more. "But I think maybe something else possible." "What do you mean?" "Some Apache learn white man's ways, live in peace. Some white men respect Apache, learn from us. Maybe you bridge between two worlds." The idea was intriguing but frightening. Sarah had been raised to think of Apache as savage enemies, but her experience in the camp was forcing her to reconsider those beliefs. The people she was living among were complex human beings with their own culture, their own values, their own hopes and fears. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for something like that," she said. "Spirits not choose weak people for important tasks," Ayana replied. "You here for reason. Maybe reason bigger than you think." That night, as Sarah lay on her sleeping mat listening to the night sounds of the desert, she found herself wondering if Ayana might be right. Perhaps her capture had been more than random chance. Perhaps she was being given an opportunity to understand something important, to play some small role in healing the wounds between two peoples. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. But, as she drifted toward sleep, Sarah realized that for the first time since her capture, she was beginning to think about the future with something other than pure dread. The first real test of Sarah's adaptation to Apache life came 3 weeks after the move to the mountain camp. A hunting party had brought back a wounded warrior who had encountered a mountain lion while tracking elk. The man's injuries were severe, and the camp's medicine woman was away visiting relatives in another band. Grandmother approached Sarah with a mixture of desperation and hope in her eyes. "You know white man medicine?" she asked in her broken English. Sarah's medical knowledge was limited to basic frontier first aid, but she had helped her mother tend to various injuries over the years. More importantly, she had been present when the circuit doctor visited their settlement and had observed his techniques for cleaning wounds and preventing infection. "I know a little," she replied honestly. "But I'll need clean cloth and hot water." What followed was Sarah's first real collaboration with the Apache women. They worked together to prepare the supplies she requested, boiling water in a metal pot that had obviously been traded from white settlers, and tearing up cloth that had been saved from captured wagon trains. The wounded warrior was a young man named Nailnish, barely older than Sarah herself. He had lost a significant amount of blood from deep gashes on his arm and shoulder, and Sarah could see that infection was already beginning to set in around the edges of the wounds. Working by firelight, with grandmother translating her instructions to the other women, Sarah cleaned the wounds as thoroughly as she could and applied poultices made from plants that grandmother assured her had healing properties. The combination of white medical techniques and Apache herbal knowledge seemed to work, and, by morning, the warrior's fever had broken. Word of Sarah's success spread quickly through the camp, and her status shifted noticeably. No longer was she just a captive being tolerated, she was someone who had contributed to the welfare of the community. The change in how people treated her was subtle but unmistakable. Ayana visited her the day after the healing, his expression thoughtful. "Grandmother says you have gift for helping sick people," he said. "I just did what I could," Sarah replied. "Any decent person would have done the same." "Maybe," Ayana said. "But Apache believe healing gift come from spirits. Maybe this why you brought to us." Over the following days, Sarah found herself being consulted about various minor ailments around the camp. A child with a persistent cough, an older man with aching joints, a woman whose pregnancy was causing her unusual discomfort. She treated what she could with her limited knowledge, always working in partnership with the Apache women who knew which plants and remedies were safe to use. The collaboration taught her more about Apache culture than weeks of observation had revealed. She learned that the Apache had a sophisticated understanding of medicine that rivaled anything she had encountered in white settlements. They knew which plants could reduce fever, which could prevent infection, which could ease pain without causing harmful side effects. More importantly, she began to understand the Apache concept of balance. Health was not just the absence of disease, but a harmonious relationship between the individual and the natural world. Illness was often seen as a sign that this balance had been disrupted, and treatment involved restoring harmony rather than simply attacking symptoms. White man medicine tried to fight sickness, grandmother explained during one of their conversations. Apache medicine tried to help body remember how to be strong. The distinction was profound, and Sarah found herself reconsidering many of the assumptions she had brought from her previous life. In the white settlements, people often seemed to view nature as something to be conquered and controlled. But the Apache saw themselves as part of nature, dependent on maintaining proper relationships with all the elements of their environment. This philosophical difference became even more apparent when Ayana began teaching Sarah to hunt. At first, she resisted the idea, arguing that hunting was men's work and that she had no experience with weapons. But Ayana insisted that anyone living in Apache territory needed to know how to find food and defend themselves. "Women hunt too," he explained. "Different animals, different ways, but still hunting. And you need to understand how Apache think about taking life." The lessons began with basic skills like tracking and moving quietly through the forest. Sarah was amazed by how much information Ayana could read from barely visible signs in the dirt. A slight depression in the soil told him that a deer had passed this way recently. A broken twig indicated which direction it had been traveling. Disturbed vegetation revealed whether the animal had been walking, running, or pausing to feed. Everything in forest tells story, Ayana said. Apache learned to read story, understand what happened, what will happen next. Learning to move silently was even more challenging. Sarah's frontier upbringing had taught her to be cautious, but not to move with the ghost-like silence that came naturally to Ayana. Every step had to be planned, every movement considered. She had to learn to feel the ground with her feet before putting her full weight down, to avoid branches and vegetation that might rustle or snap. But the most difficult lesson was understanding the Apache attitude toward taking life. When they finally tracked a small deer to a position where Ayana could make a clean kill with his bow, he spent several minutes in what Sarah realized was a form of prayer. "We ask permission," he explained quietly. "Tell animal why we need its life, promise to use everything, waste nothing. Thank spirits for gift of food." The ceremony that followed the kill was equally elaborate. Every part of the deer was carefully processed and preserved. The meat would feed several families, the hide would be worked into clothing or tools, the bones would become needles and scrapers, even the sinews would be used for bowstrings and thread. "White men kill buffalo, take only hide, leave meat to rot," Ayana said with obvious disgust. "Apache not understand such waste. All life sacred, must be treated with respect." Through these lessons, Sarah began to understand that Apache culture was built around principles of sustainability and reciprocity that were almost completely absent from the white settlements she knew. Every action was considered in terms of its impact on the larger community, both human and natural. This awareness made her increasingly uncomfortable with the behavior of her own people. She remembered stories of buffalo hunters who killed hundreds of animals just for their hides, leaving vast fields of rotting carcasses. She thought about homesteaders who cut down ancient forests without considering the animals that depended on them, or miners who poisoned streams in their quest for gold. The moral complexity of her situation deepened when a messenger arrived from another Apache band with news that created excitement and concern throughout the camp. A group of white settlers had been attacked about 50 miles to the south, and several had been killed. The survivors had escaped to a military fort, and now a large force of cavalry was mobilizing to track down the responsible warriors. Sarah listened to the discussions that followed with growing unease. Some of the younger warriors seemed eager to join the fighting, viewing it as an opportunity to gain honor and strike back at their oppressors. Others, particularly the older men, counseled caution and pointed out that increased military activity would make life dangerous for all Apache bands in the territory. "What will happen?" Sarah asked Ayana after one particularly heated council session. "Hard to say," he replied. "Some want to fight, prove Apache still strong. Others think better to stay hidden, wait for soldiers to go away." "And you? What do you think?" Ayana was quiet for a long moment. "I think fighting only bring more fighting. But I also think Apache cannot run forever. Someday must make stand, or disappear completely." The arrival of the messenger had also brought disturbing personal news for Sarah. Among the items captured in the raid was a letter from her father to the territorial governor, offering a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts and requesting additional military assistance in searching for her. "Your family's still looking," Ayana told her gently. "Still hope you alive." The knowledge that her parents hadn't given up hope was both comforting and painful. Sarah imagined her father riding out every day to search the surrounding country, her mother maintaining vigil by the window, watching for any sign of her return. The idea that her continued absence was causing them such anguish made her question whether she was making the right choice by remaining with the Apache. "Maybe I should try to get word to them," she suggested. "Let them know I'm alive and safe." "Too dangerous," Ayana replied firmly. "Message could be traced back to camp. Put everyone in danger. Then, what? Do I just disappear from their lives forever?" "Maybe not forever," Ayana said. "But, now, with soldiers looking, too dangerous for anyone." The conversation left Sarah feeling trapped between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. She had grown to care about the Apache people who had become her community, but she couldn't forget the family that was mourning her loss. The longer she remained missing, the harder it would become to explain her absence if she ever did return home. Her internal struggle intensified when she overheard a conversation between two of the Apache women about her future. They were discussing the possibility that she might eventually marry within the tribe, perhaps to Ayanna himself. The idea shocked her, not because it was necessarily unpleasant, but because it represented a complete break with everything she had been raised to expect from life. Marriage to an Apache warrior would mean accepting that she would never return to white society. Her children would be Apache, raised in the desert, learning the old ways. She would become part of a culture that her own people viewed as savage and primitive, cutting herself off forever from the world of her birth. Yet as the days passed, Sarah found herself seriously considering the possibility. Life among the Apache had taught her things about strength and independence that she never could have learned in white society. The women here were partners in survival, not decorative ornaments dependent on male protection. They had skills and knowledge that commanded respect, and their voices carried weight in community decisions. Ayanna himself had become important to her in ways that surprised her. Their daily conversations had revealed depths of intelligence and sensitivity that challenged every stereotype she had held about Apache men. He treated her as an equal, someone whose thoughts and opinions mattered. In contrast, the young men she had known in the white settlements had seemed shallow and presumptuous, assuming that marriage would give them ownership of a woman's life and thoughts. The crisis came to a head when scouts reported that a large cavalry force was approaching the general area where their camp was located. The soldiers weren't heading directly for them yet, but they were clearly conducting a systematic search of the mountain canyons. An emergency council was called, and, for the first time, Sarah was invited to participate. The debate was conducted in Apache, but Ayanna translated the main points for her benefit. Some argued for immediate flight to even more remote areas. Others proposed preparing for battle if they were discovered. A few suggested that the best solution might be to return the white woman to her own people, eliminating the reason for the search. Sarah listened to the arguments with growing anxiety. She realized that her presence was dividing the community, creating conflicts that could have serious consequences for everyone. The practical solution was obvious, but it required a sacrifice that she wasn't sure she was ready to make. When the time came for her to speak, Sarah stood slowly and looked around at the faces gathered in the firelight. These people had become her teachers, her protectors, her friends. Some of them were prepared to risk their lives rather than give her up, and the weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable. "I came here by accident," she said, speaking slowly so that those who understood some English could follow her words while Ayanna translated for the others. "I never chose to be here, but you have made me welcome. You have taught me things I never knew, shown me ways of living I never imagined." She paused, gathering her courage for what she knew she had to say next. "But my presence is putting all of you in danger. The soldiers are looking for me, and they won't stop until they find me or until they're convinced I'm dead. Every day I stay here increases the risk to your children, your families, your way of life." The council listened in respectful silence as Ayanna translated her words. Sarah could see various reactions in their faces, from agreement to disappointment to something that might have been admiration for her willingness to consider the welfare of others above her own preferences. "I don't want to leave," she continued. "This place has become home to me in ways I never expected. But if my staying means that innocent people might die, then I have to go." What followed was the longest night of Sarah's life. The council debated her words and the various alternatives until nearly dawn. Some argued that her willingness to sacrifice herself for the community proved that she belonged among them. Others maintained that the practical risks were too great to ignore. In the end, it was Ayanna who proposed the solution that the council finally accepted. It was dangerous and uncertain, but it offered the possibility of protecting both Sarah and the Apache community that had become her home. Ayanna's plan was both simple and incredibly risky. Instead of simply returning Sarah to the soldiers or fleeing deeper into the wilderness, he proposed something that had never been attempted before in the long conflict between the Apache and the white settlers. He would escort Sarah to a neutral meeting place where she could be reunited with her family, but he would also use the opportunity to establish communication with the military commander. "Too much killing," he explained to Sarah as they prepared for the journey. "Apache children die, white children die, nothing change except more hate. Maybe time to try different way. The idea of using her return as an opening for peace negotiations was both inspiring and terrifying. Sarah understood that if the plan failed, Ayanna would almost certainly be killed, and the resulting conflict might destroy the Apache band that had protected her. But, if it succeeded, it might mark the beginning of a new relationship between the two peoples. The council had debated Ayanna's proposal throughout the night, with passionate arguments on both sides. Many felt that any contact with the soldiers would end in betrayal and death. Others pointed out that the current path of constant warfare was slowly destroying Apache culture anyway, as bands were forced to live in increasingly marginal areas where traditional ways of life became impossible. In the end, it was the intervention of the eldest woman in the camp, a grandmother whose wisdom was respected by everyone, that decided the matter. She spoke of a vision she had received, of a white woman and an Apache warrior standing together at the edge of two worlds, building a bridge that others could cross. "Spirits show me this woman's face many winters ago," she told the council. "I know then, that someday she come to us, bring message of change. Maybe this the time spirits meant." With the decision made, preparations for the dangerous journey began immediately. Sarah would travel with Ayanna and 2 other warriors to a valley about 30 miles from the nearest military post. There, they would build a signal fire that could be seen from the fort, and Ayanna would approach under a flag of truce to deliver a message proposing a meeting. The message itself had been carefully composed by the council, translated into English by Sarah, and copied onto papers salvaged from previous raids. It was brief but significant, the first formal communication ever sent from this Apache band to the military authorities. "We have the white woman Sarah Mackenzie," the message read. "She is alive and well. We wish to return her to her family without violence. We also wish to speak of peace between our peoples. Send 1 officer, no more than 10 soldiers, to Owl Creek Valley 3 days from when you receive this message. Come in peace, and peace will be offered." As they traveled toward the rendezvous point, Sarah found herself reflecting on the transformation she had undergone during her time with the Apache. The frightened young woman who had been captured while bathing in the creek had been replaced by someone stronger and more confident. She had learned skills she never knew she possessed and discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known existed. More importantly, she had gained a perspective on the conflict between whites and Apaches that neither side typically possessed. She understood the legitimate fears and grievances on both sides, and she had seen the possibility for coexistence that most people on both sides denied could exist. "Are you afraid?" Ayanna asked as they made camp on their final night before reaching the valley. "Terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if they don't believe we're serious about peace? What if they just try to capture or kill you?" "Then, we die trying to do right thing," Ayanna replied with a calmness that she envied. "Better than living always with war." The next morning, they reached Owl Creek Valley, a broad meadow surrounded by hills that provided excellent visibility in all directions. The creek itself was substantial enough to support a temporary camp, and there were groves of trees that would provide shelter and concealment if needed. While the other warriors concealed themselves in positions where they could observe the approach routes, Ayanna and Sarah built the signal fire according to Apache techniques that would produce maximum smoke visibility. The fire itself was small, but, by feeding it green vegetation, they created a column of white smoke that could be seen for miles. Then came the waiting. They had no way of knowing whether the message had even been delivered, much less whether the military authorities would take it seriously. The proposal might be dismissed as a trap, or the commander might decide to send a larger force to attack rather than negotiate. On the second day, Apache scouts reported movement from the direction of the fort. A small group of soldiers was approaching, following the creek toward the valley. The size of the force suggested that the military commander was at least willing to explore the possibility of a peaceful resolution. Sarah felt her heart racing as she watched the distant figures of the approaching soldiers. After months of wondering whether she would ever see her own people again, the moment of reunion was finally at hand. But, mixed with anticipation was anxiety about how she would be received. Would her family and community accept her after her time among the Apache? Would they understand that her captors had become her friends? The soldiers who rode into the valley were led by a young lieutenant named Benjamin Harrison, a recent graduate of West Point who had been assigned to frontier duty only 6 months earlier. He was accompanied by 8 enlisted men and, to Sarah's amazement and joy, her own father. Thomas Mackenzie had aged noticeably during the months since Sarah's disappearance. His hair had gone completely gray, and the lines on his face spoke of sleepless nights and constant worry. But, when he saw her standing beside the Apache warrior, his face lit up with a relief and joy that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The reunion was emotional but brief. After determining that Sarah was indeed unharmed and confirming that she had been well treated during her captivity, Lieutenant Harrison turned his attention to the unprecedented situation of an Apache warrior requesting a peace conference. Ayanna stepped forward with dignity, his hands empty of weapons, his posture respectful but not submissive. When he spoke, his English had improved dramatically during his conversations with Sarah, allowing him to communicate directly with the officer. "I am Ayanna of the Chiricahua people," he said formally. "I bring greetings from my chief and my people. We wish to speak of ending the war between us." Lieutenant Harrison was clearly out of his depth. His military training had prepared him for combat operations, not diplomatic negotiations with hostile tribes. But he was intelligent enough to recognize the significance of the moment. "I don't have authority to negotiate treaties," he admitted. "That would require approval from the territorial governor and, probably, officials in Washington." "We understand," Ayanna replied. "But maybe we start small. Make agreement about this area, this time. Show both sides that peace possible." What followed was the most extraordinary conversation Sarah had ever witnessed. The young Apache warrior and the inexperienced army officer, speaking across a cultural divide that had been bridged by violence for generations, began to explore the possibilities for coexistence. Ayanna proposed a temporary truce in a specific geographical area, a cessation of raids and reprisals that might serve as a test case for larger agreements. In return, the Apache would share information about hostile bands from other regions and assist in tracking down raiders who violated the peace. Lieutenant Harrison listened with growing interest. The proposal offered potential solutions to problems that had plagued the territory for years. If even one Apache band could be pacified through negotiation rather than warfare, it might provide a model for dealing with other groups. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," Harrison said finally. "But I think there are people who would be very interested in what you're proposing." The formal discussion continued for several hours, with Sarah serving as an unofficial translator and cultural interpreter. Her months of living with the Apache had given her insights into their way of thinking that proved invaluable in helping the two sides understand each other. As the day wore on, she found herself thinking about the possibility that this meeting might actually lead to something significant. The war between whites and Apaches had seemed like an inevitable fact of frontier life, but perhaps it didn't have to be. Perhaps with enough goodwill and understanding on both sides, a different future was possible. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Harrison asked about the specific grievances that drove Apache resistance. Instead of giving the generic responses about defending their homeland, Ayanna provided concrete details about broken promises, stolen goods, and unpunished crimes committed by white settlers and soldiers. "Last year, traders sell my people blankets with sickness," Ayanna said. "Many children die. Before that, miners poison water in Sacred Canyon. Apache ask for justice, get only more soldiers." Harrison listened with obvious discomfort, but, to his credit, he didn't deny or excuse the incidents. "Those things shouldn't have happened," he said. "Maybe part of any peace agreement should include ways to prevent them from happening again." By evening, the outline of a potential agreement had emerged. It was limited in scope and would require approval from higher authorities on both sides, but it represented something unprecedented in the history of white-Apache relations, a negotiated peace based on mutual respect rather than the surrender of one side to the other. As the soldiers prepared to return to their fort, Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. Her father was obviously expecting her to return with him, to resume her old life as if nothing had happened. But months of living among the Apache had changed her in ways that she wasn't sure her family could understand or accept. "You don't have to decide right now," Ayanna told her quietly as they stood apart from the others. "Take time, think about what you want." "What about you?" Sarah asked. "If these negotiations actually lead somewhere, what will you do?" "My people need someone who understands both worlds," Ayana replied. "Maybe that my path now. Learn more about white man's ways, help build bridge between peoples." The idea of Ayana adapting to life in white society was as radical as the idea of Sarah remaining with the Apache. But perhaps that was what the situation required, people willing to cross cultural boundaries and serve as interpreters between two very different ways of life. In the end, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She would return home with her father, but only temporarily. She would use her time in white society to promote understanding of Apache culture and to build support for the peace negotiations that were beginning. When the time was right, when trust had been established on both sides, she would return to serve as a permanent liaison between the two communities. "You're talking about dedicating your life to this," her father said when she explained her plan. "Giving up any chance of a normal life, marriage, children of your own." "I'm talking about helping to end a war," Sarah replied. "And maybe I'll have those things anyway, just not in the way we originally imagined." The parting from the Apache camp was emotional. The people who had been her captors had become her teachers and friends. Grandmother pressed a small medicine pouch into her hands, explaining that it would help her remember the lessons she had learned. The children shyly offered gifts of beadwork and small carvings. Ayana walked with her to the edge of the valley where her father and the soldiers waited. Their goodbye was private, conducted in a mixture of Apache and English that had become their common language. "Will I see you again?" Sarah asked. "If spirits will it," Ayana replied. "But maybe not for a long time. Much work to do first." As she rode away from the valley beside her father, Sarah looked back once to see Ayana still standing where she had left him, a solitary figure against the vast landscape. The sight filled her with both sadness and hope. 6 months later, the limited peace agreement negotiated between Lieutenant Harrison and Ayana's band was signed by territorial authorities and approved by the Apache Council. It was the first successful peace treaty between whites and Apaches in the region's history, and it served as a model for similar agreements with other bands. Sarah kept her promise to return, establishing a trading post at the boundary between white and Apache territories. The post became a place where people from both cultures could meet safely, conducting business and slowly building the trust that would be essential for lasting peace. Ayana also kept his word, learning to navigate white society while maintaining his Apache identity. He became an advocate for his people in territorial courts and government offices, ensuring that treaty obligations were honored on both sides. 3 years after their first meeting in Owl Creek Valley, Sarah and Ayana were married in a ceremony that honored traditions from both cultures. Their union became a symbol of the possibility for understanding and cooperation between peoples who had once been enemies. Their children grew up speaking both Apache and English, comfortable in both the trading post and the traditional camps, serving as living bridges between two worlds. The war that had once seemed inevitable gradually gave way to an uneasy but genuine peace, built on the foundation of respect and understanding that Sarah and Ayana had helped to establish. The story of the white woman found bathing and the Apache warrior who chose negotiation over violence became legend in the territory. It demonstrated that even the most intractable conflicts could be resolved when people were willing to see their enemies as human beings with legitimate needs and grievances. Sarah's journey from captive to peacemaker had transformed not only her own life but the lives of countless others. The creek where she had been captured became a symbol of renewal and possibility, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most profound changes. The promise that Ayana had made on that first day, that she would always be his, had been fulfilled in ways that neither of them could have imagined. But it had also become something larger, a promise that different peoples could always find ways to live together in peace, if they had the courage to try.